Ah, yes. Hopes and dreams. Ideals and passion. The grand twinkle of youth. While my own decade of experience with competitive sport may have rendered me jaded and old, I'm no stranger to blazing passion and lofty dreams. Another thing I'm no stranger to is being mid, just like Umamusume Season 1. Nah, I'm just kidding. However, it does appear that the majority stance is that Season 1 is generally tamer than the other seasons, and some even think it was made purely to, quote, pave the way for what came after it. That's not to say that Season 1 isn't a fantastic story on its own, but they are technically right, as galling as it is to admit. Now take a moment and ask yourself, can a story really exist solely to set the stage for what comes next? While it is, of course, important to recognize that claiming a story exists purely to set up or pave the way for future stories is at least mildly disrespectful, the opposite, that is, writing a story with no thought of what's to come, is similarly foolish. This remains true for Umamusume despite its episodic nature, as the world and setting are retained between seasons. Disrespect or no, Season 1 was overshadowed by what followed it. However, that is partially thanks to the efforts it made to bolster its successors. So let's dive into just how Season 1 of Umamusume achieved precisely what it did. I've heard a lot of people say that you can dive straight into any of Umamusume's seasons or spin-offs without needing to watch the ones before them, that any of them makes a decent starting point, and that the chronological order of the series real horse-wise is actually completely out of whack. Normally, I'd take a more neutral stance like I did in the intro and say they're not wrong, that you can start wherever or with whoever you like, but no, not this time. I'm going to have to take the reins here and remind you that a good chunk of world building actually happens in Season 1, thanks in part to Special Week, but we'll get to her later. Stories that focus on different characters per season are difficult to quantify, and the fact that they are leads to thought processes like those. But when there is a chronological order, at least in terms of production, it means that there is some intent for the media to be consumed in that order. And for good reason, because having a previous season tends to affect how a show is perceived depending on whether you watched that previous season or not. Preconceptions are formed and broken, characters are familiar rather than strange. Having this foreknowledge can easily enhance your experience of any sequel. The formation of Spica and how Teo and McQueen are both inducted, for example, may be important context to the beginnings of their relationship. More importantly, Season 1 develops Trayson and the world as a whole, making the story more believable overall. Of course, there are too many random bits and pieces to ramble on about them without some form of organization, so let's hear it straight from the horse's mouth. What does a first season have to do to, quote, pave the way? As part of all these videos, research is obviously a must. However, this time it turned up nothing. What I did find were plenty of guidelines on how to write a first chapter, for which the TV equivalent would be a first episode. Although a first episode isn't a whole story, I still believe there is much to learn from that guidance that can be applied to first seasons. There are a few things every first chapter needs: protagonist, setting, hook, mood, and inciting incident. All relatively self-explanatory, yet difficult to execute. The thing is that shoving all of this into a small amount of text, pages, or time is the challenge that writers face in order to properly bait their readers into engaging with the gacha system. Retrospectively, the same applies to first seasons. All we need to do is extend the parameters a little. First off, protagonists. While we may not retain our beloved Special Week for the next season, the protagonist of Season 1 is not without her merits. Remember how I said things had to be set up? Everyone's second favorite fatty is delightfully naive, adorably clumsy, and, above all, hasn't seen another Umamusume for her entire life. When a protagonist is built like this being ignorant of the world around them, whether by circumstance or coincidence, it's easier to do lore dumps because other characters get to dump to them instead of you as the reader. It's a decent way to make these tiring sort of dumps more palatable, which isn't to say it's infallible, but instead to say that it is an option. But of course, there wouldn't be anything special about the week if she could be boiled down to 3 definitive character traits. In most cases, it's not what archetype the character is that's special. What matters is how you put your own spin on it. Special Week may be naive, but it is because of that naivety that she can bear the weight of her lofty dreams, eat without a care in the world, and have the confidence to proclaim those same dreams for everyone to hear. Rather than the naivety itself, those are the traits that Spei is loved for. And let's not forget the other characters, who shape and are shaped by Spei, and who are always the protagonists of their own stories, and sometimes even the protagonist of another season. Spei might be our main character, but this only further underlines the importance of her rivals, friends, and everyone in between. The short of the setting is that it has to be crafted with meticulous intention. The long of it can be found here. Hooks are a little awkward when thought about season to season rather than in a first episode, especially so when season 2 tells a different story. To tie back into the characters section, if you want your viewers to continue the same franchise with a different story, you'd better make those alternate stories compelling. That means properly developing the characters and making sure they aren't overshadowed in any way. Your main cast should be able to easily stand on their own. As is common with stories that make like school was actually fun, there are a lot more characters than there might need to be in any other story. After all, the classes, paddocks, and teams need to be filled. As much as you might try, there's only so many stories that can fit in your limited runtime, and each of those detracts from the main character's screen time. Just like with everything else, you need to balance who appears, when, and for how long. Season 1 is really efficient with its time. Sparse scenes develop some characters more than an entire season of some other series. And with such sparse scenes, we develop interest in those open-ended stories, wondering about and gaining appreciation for where they might go and end. Hence, we watch Umamusume's 9 billion spin-offs, exploring different characters and stories, and we enjoy them. We enjoy them! Setting the mood is arguably almost as important as the characters. We may swap protagonists and have different stories with different hooks and different inciting incidents, but if we know that the world is the same and the story will be similar, with the only difference being the protagonist, then we have an expectation that the mood of the story will be similar. That is to say, what Season 1 does will actually restrict what Season 2 is able to do, in terms of emotional scope. I think that one of the reasons Season 1 is said to be tamer than Season 2 is because the latter does the same thing that Season 1 does but to greater effect. For instance, while Spei might not be reflected with anything more serious than the consequences of her actions, Teo, well, you know. This contrast between what happens per season could very well be a major part of how watching Season 1 can so easily change how Season 2 is perceived. The last part, inciting incidents, matters very little between seasons of Umamusume thanks to the fact that the stories from Seasons 1 and 2 have nothing to do with each other. So, regarding all the aspects discussed here, what's the lowest common denominator? The answer is continuity. The most important and common thing about all these aspects is that they are continuous. They can and will persist much further into the series, creating expectations to later be lived up to or subverted, whether in a positive or negative manner. And it's those expectations that underlie the importance of executing all these aspects well. Imagine a story that was marketed as and appeared to be lighthearted and comedic, but somewhere along the way made a random switch into heavy-handed action. Though it may seem like Umamusume's continuity is rather minimal, without that tiny bit of information, the audience's confusion over races, Tracen, and even Umamusume themselves may impact their perception of the story. Season 1 was clearly made by some very forward-thinking people. Starting with the clueless protagonist rushing into a track to watch a race was not something that happened by chance. Even if Season 2 starts with a Tracen Academy Open Campus Day, allowing a newer audience to acclimate to the world in its own way, the pace is much faster, and many important events have already happened by the end of the first episode. The same forethought that put those scenes at the beginning of Season 1 may have worked on Season 2's first episode with that in mind. Since the audience knows what they do, it opens up the avenue to put those scenes first, allowing for a stronger and more dynamic start. That's not to say I know what the creators of Umamusume were thinking, but it is what I believe would be a reasonable thought process given the existence of a previous season. All that being said, though Season 1 certainly got glued by Season 2, quality-wise, it still stands as a fantastic story on its own. I didn't make this whole video to insinuate that Season 1 only exists to make Teo look cooler. In fact, I wanted to highlight something about it that I thought was done well. If this is that push you need to go ahead and watch Season 1, that's great. You just might find a diamond in the rough.